depending on where in the world you are. I just want to make sure that I'm coming through clear for everyone. Maybe if someone can nod or mention in the chat if I'm coming through. All right, looks like we're set. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining CABC today for our special webinar on ASEAN under COVID-19 and the implications for Canadian businesses. Before we kick things off here, I'd just like to give a special thanks to the sponsor of today's session and member of CABC, Tractus Asia. Without their support and their logistics, this meeting wouldn't have been possible. And I'm sure that, like me, many of you are excited to be hearing from them shortly. Just before we kick things off, I'll run through a few housekeeping notes. So this webinar will be recorded. We have partners from around the world who would like to hear this content, and the time zone isn't always possible. We also ask that all of our participants, except for speakers, remain on mute, and also to keep your cameras off at all times to prevent the platform from lagging. Finally, we will be having a Q&A section, and we encourage all of our participants to share their questions. However, we will be collecting questions via the chat function of the webinar, and these will be submitted directly to the organizer, and we will address them during our Q&A portion later in the session. We'll just take a quick look at our agenda. Can we switch slide yet? So we're very pleased to have Canada's ambassador to ASEAN with us, Deidre Kelly, who will open with some remarks, and then she'll move into a panel discussion with our great speakers, Evans from Tractus and Martin Deshotel from DFDL. And following that panel discussion, we'll have the Q&A portion. We'll keep our questions until the end of the session. We have a lot of content to go through, and no doubt lots of questions coming through, so we'll do our best to get through everything. So without any further ado then, I'd like to pass things over to the president of the CABC, Wayne Farmer, for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Much time here, as I know that everyone's looking forward to the dialogue and the presentation, but I'd like to make a couple of comments. First, we have about a little over 130 people from across the globe, really, ASEAN and Canada, but also elsewhere around Asia, dialing into the webinar today. So that's a fantastic number. It seems that perhaps this virtual meeting arrangement can indeed work out. So fingers crossed for the rest of the programming over the course of the year, which will be shifting to this type of a format, as Greg will have no doubt, Greg and Nikki will have let you know already, or will, as our events roll out over the course of the next few months. But this is the first webinar that we have for the year. So I'd like to thank, firstly, Tractus for helping make this possible, for both participating and their sponsorship. We'd also like to thank our patron members, of course, who keep the council ticking along: Scotiabank, National Bank of Canada, Manulife, Export Development of Canada, Sun Life Financial, and Bank of Montreal, as well as all our other members of different categories who support us, and thanks for that continued support. We'd also like to thank the Canadian Chambers of Commerce in ASEAN, who've also helped us organizing this event, and who have also dialed in to attend. Clearly, the world these days is a little bit different, and the COVID-19 is affecting all of us in many ways, both personal and professional. And it's great to get a few pointers on this from our panel of Martin and John, as well as some commentary from Deirdre on how we can all adapt and prosper, like not having your earbuds fall out of your ear while you're talking. I think with that, we can hand things over to Deirdre, Ambassador Kelly, who's in Jakarta, and she can say a few words, and then we can get into our panel discussion and presentations. Thank you for dialing in, everyone.
Great, Wayne. Thank you very much for that introduction. I am very happy to be here with you and all of the participants for today's discussion. As COVID-19 continues to spread across the world, so does the economic impact, which is being felt by all of us. And I can tell you that the Government of Canada, in cooperation with our provinces, have taken tough measures required to combat the spread of virus, while also coming in with financial support for Canadians to help offset the economic impacts that are now being felt across the country and around the world. These changes will have profound and lasting impacts at the individual, community, national, and international levels. And the pandemic will affect how governments work, how the private sector conducts business, and it will likely reshape to some extent the geopolitics of the region. Although at this time it's too soon to predict exactly how. However, what we do know is that the pandemic is very unlikely to alter Canada's DNA as a trading nation. We will continue to want to engage in trade, and to do so, market diversification will be key. Even in these adverse times, Canada is committed to promoting free trade, multilateral cooperation, and rules-based international order. Minister Champagne and his colleagues have been having a series of calls with their counterparts to describe and to discuss how to manage the crisis. And in spearheading these calls, Canada has brought focus on enhancing coordination, not only on the health response, but on the need to maintain supply chains, air bridges, and other issues related to the medium-term economic impacts. Here in the ASEAN region, one of the key activities that the mission is focused on is promoting and advancing our trade diversification agenda in Southeast Asia. The current situation has not changed that. In fact, it's only reinforced the need for enhanced Canada-ASEAN ties. We believe that our future prosperity and security are increasingly interlinked with the developments in the region. And during the last few years, we've taken specific and concrete steps to grow that relationship. As part of our commitment to enhance this engagement, we are seeking membership through a number of ASEAN fora, but we are also looking to advance a possible Canada-ASEAN free trade negotiation. At this point, it's unclear what the specific effects of the pandemic will have on Canada-ASEAN relations, but we are pleased to see that ASEAN member states are engaged on discussions. In fact, at the end of April, we had another round of conversations to bring us closer together on some of our areas of divergence, and hope that we will continue to see progress as we move towards the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting later this summer. Now, I know that the participants did not turn into the call to hear from me. We have a number of renowned panelists on, and people are key to submit questions. So what I would like to do at this point is move ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Mr. John Evans, who is the co-founder and managing director of Tractus Asia. John is a founding partner and the managing director of Tractus. During more than 2 decades in Asia, he has managed consulting projects in a wide variety of sectors, including chemicals, automotive, food processing, minerals, manufacturing, construction industries, among others. And in the public sector, he has provided advice and guidance to economic development and investment promotion organizations across the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, the Middle East, and North America. He has authored several chapters on the handbook for setting up business in China, and frequently gives related lectures and workshops around the world. He served as the chairperson and moderator for the first China Industrial Real Estate Conference, and has spoken at conferences hosted by The Economist, the United Nations, the Asia Business Forum, the World Free Zones Convention, and others. So quite an impressive resume. Mr. Martin Desautos is the Managing Director and Head of the ASEAN Desk at DFDL. He has been advising and guiding investors in Southeast Asia and South Asia since 1999. He's specialized in international banking and finance law at the London School of Economics. And before joining DFDL, he worked for the largest French international law firm, notably on project finance in Vietnam for Phu My 2.2 Power project. He has also worked on a number of major projects in energy and infrastructure in the ASEAN region, notably on PPP, as well as done dozens of energy projects in Laos, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia, acting for sponsors, lenders, and government. So with that, and without further ado, I would like to turn over to John and to hear about industry impacts of COVID-19 in the ASEAN region. So John, over to you.
Ambassador Kelly, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I wanted to thank you for moderating, and also thank Wayne and CABC for the opportunity to be here. What I'm going to do is just give a short presentation on the current status of COVID-19 from a business perspective and what that can mean to Canadian trade and businesses. As you heard the ambassador say, I have spent a long time in the region. I co-founded the firm here in Thailand. We now have 9 offices across the region. I spent almost a little over a decade in China working on promoting trade and investment there. And we have a long list of private sector companies that we've assisted in the region from Canada, as well as about 10 economic development organizations where we've helped facilitate trade into ASEAN and the rest of Asia, as well as attract investment from the region. I've had the opportunity to work with DFDL on a number of co-projects over the years, and I really appreciate Martin's attendance today for this event. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I think what's really important to think about in this new era we have of COVID-19 is to be able to think about what it means from a business perspective. And I think a lot of people in North America are currently being impacted by where Canada and the US is in its viral curve. And a lot of the focus is being on how do we look at our domestic businesses, how do we look at stay at home, what are we going to do now as the virus is sort of in the mid-curve. And I think it's really important to think about that this started in Asia. Of course, it started in China, and it spread first into ASEAN and then into Korea and to the region. And so if you look at the curve for most of the ASEAN countries, as well as the other Asian countries, they've done a good job of flattening the curve, some better than others. As an example, Singapore had a recent outbreak, but they have pretty small numbers and they've managed things pretty well. And most of the region has either put in place, lockdowns or curfews or stay-at-home rules. And with few exceptions, they've flattened the curve. And so I think from a business perspective, as a Canadian business, I need to be thinking about where my markets are going to come from. And those markets are going to come from Asia, and they're going to come from some of the countries that have already flattened the curve and that are getting back to, whether you want to call it the new, the overused new normal, or, a more robust economic situation. And, we're going to focus on ASEAN today. And, ASEAN overall is in pretty good shape as we're moving forward. Next slide, please. So let's just talk about trade with ASEAN a little bit. And ASEAN is already Canada's 6th largest export market. And if you look at the trade that happened in 2019, bilateral trade increased by 8% between Canada and ASEAN. Now, while there's a trade deficit in Canada, so we imported more into Canada than we exported, and there was a slight decrease in exports to ASEAN. don't be deceived by those numbers, because if you look on the right-hand side and you look at the, which segments of the economy we're exporting, the biggest drops were in things that are commodity-based, pulp and paper, the mineral products, which of course are part of Canada's exports, but at the same time will move up and down as economies go through cycles. I think what is more important is to look at what's happened in two areas, one of which is the agro-foods chain, which of course, from a commodity basis, Canada has always been a very strong exporter into the region, but also if you go down to the bottom of that chart, 15% increase into ASEAN into prepared foodstuffs and beverages. So if I am a company anywhere in the agro-foods chain, from whether it's a commodities or even down onto the retail side, logistics, cold chain management, you have this tremendous market across ASEAN to bring in Canadian, not only products, but solutions. The other thing that I think is very interesting if you look at this is machinery and mechanical appliances. So machinery exports into ASEAN increased by 30% this past year over 2018, which is a tremendous increase. And a lot of people don't think necessarily of Canada as, that exporter of machinery, but if you look at technology and machinery going into the region, it's been very strong growth. And so if I'm looking at this from a Canadian perspective, I see, of course, that the China exports have decreased slightly, and that could be expected not only with the economic and political issues of last year, but ASEAN as whole can replace a lot of that business. The other thing that I'd like to call out a little bit, while we're not talking about India today, India, while a much smaller market for exports, has also had an increase. And a lot of Indian exports sometimes get channeled through places like ASEAN and particularly Singapore. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So, challenges. Okay, when you look at the challenges that COVID has caused for us, each country's approach is different, and the challenges of dealing with the pandemic and flattening the curve and how it impacts the individual economies have been severe around the world. But I do believe if you look at the data like we had on the first slide, in Asia and in particularly in ASEAN, the governments are doing an excellent job of giving the economies back in place. And I'll give an example. Up until last week, of all of our 9 offices in Asia, the only one that was back to normal was our Shanghai office in China, which China did a fantastic job of flattening their curve. We've been operating there for 3 weeks. But Vietnam, one of the places that you wouldn't necessarily think about as being able to control the viral curve the way they have, is back to working at normal for the most part. Restaurants are back open. Thailand, where I'm sitting here in Bangkok, they're relaxing the restrictions on things. And so while there's certainly a concern for a resurgence, I think that if you look at what the governments have done with COVID, there's clear indication that they're going to manage well through any resurgence, and so these economies are going to be vital. The other issue, and Ambassador Kelly brought it up a little bit, geopolitical issues. The U.S.-China trade war that decimated not only U.S. exports and increased the cost of goods for consumers, impacted, of course, Canada severely for several reasons. And I won't go into those, you all know those. It's very likely that we're going to see increased tensions between the U.S. and China going forward. So from a Canadian perspective, in one sense, that's negative. On the other side, it's going to create some opportunities. And so where is it going to create opportunities? Not necessarily in China. It's going to create opportunities in places like ASEAN. The other big challenge has been the supply chain. And the supply chain has been interrupted, whether it is, the urgent demand for personal protection equipment that North America's had, and air freight rates have gone through the roof. I mean, I'll give you some examples. Sending air freight to North America from ASEAN is normally about $300,000 to charter a cargo airplane. It's currently about $1.3 to $1.5 million, so 4 to 5 times that. The supply chain that normally functioned with container ships going routinely back and forth, full on both sides, regular shipments, COVID has impacted that, where boats were sitting offshore. They weren't able to go through customs. And so the supply chain itself has been disrupted. And then if you think about the manufacturing world and whether that's being done in Canada or whether it's being done in Asia, people not being able to go to work. So there's a lot of work left to do to look at supply chains. And I think one of the things that is going to happen is you're going to see a more regionalized approach to investment in trade. You're no longer going to have investments in countries like China where you're going to try and supply the world. Companies, the trend is to put smaller operations in near market, which means for Canadian companies, you may be investing in ASEAN for ASEAN. You may do a little bit of export back to Canada. You're going to be setting up sales and distribution offices in ASEAN, and not only in Singapore to sell into the region, but into many of the countries to be able to sell. And then I think the final thing is, you know, this new isolation economy. Here we are, 100 plus attendees on this conference call this morning. This is the new norm. And I'm somebody who traveled a little bit more than 300,000 air miles last year. I've traveled once this year. And so it's very new to me, and it's new to everyone. And I think figuring out how we do this and make it effective, and when the economies come back in place, being able to travel less, but still travel when needed, and be able to use Zoom and GoToMeeting and Teams for that personal contact. One of the things I think you're going to see is that we're going to develop relationships with potential business partners virtually that previously we would have flown to meet somebody first. And so by the time we're in a position where we're going to meet them, we're going to be closing deals. And so while there are a lot of challenges, I see a lot of opportunities for Canadian companies. And if you can go to the next slide. Here are just a group of companies. Some of these are clients of ours. Some of them are just examples across a wide range of spectrum of industries. Magna was quick to move from China into ASEAN for a China Plus One strategy when they needed to export automotive parts back. Clearwater Seafood has seen 15% year-on-year growth in the ASEAN markets. The opportunity for, again, wines and foods and drinks is growing right across the region. The infrastructure is still being built, and with a particular focus now on clean tech. So the Power Tech out of British Columbia has come into the region with clean tech solutions and done really well. And then the one area that I haven't really talked about is the service areas, software, artificial intelligence, the services side of financial services, whether it's insurance, all areas that Canada are really strong in. We're seeing investments into the region, and a good example is Element AI out of Quebec that came into to Singapore about 2 years ago and has seen very strong growth. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Martin, I'm sorry I've gone a little bit long, and I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Some of what I'll be saying will be crossing a similar path in terms of our conclusion to the COVID-19 crisis. So I'll be covering two main issues this morning. First is the different measures that have been put in place by the governments in the region. And then I'll look at opportunities, short-term, medium-term, and long-term opportunity. Maybe go back to the previous slide, please. Yeah, just quickly, so you understand where I'm coming from in terms of my different comments. The FDL, we have been in the region for 25 years, starting in Laos in 1994. So we specialize in emerging market. We're covering 9 countries now, 12 offices, around 400 staff, 175 lawyers and tax advisors, about 25 nationalities, several Canadians in the group throughout our different offices. We have about 1,500 to 2,000 clients in the region, both mainly foreign investors. So my comment comes a lot from my discussion as a practitioner with our client. We've been talking a lot with our client during the last the last few months, advising them on how to deal with the C-19 crisis. A lot of regulatory issue and transaction issue you can imagine, come up during this period. Personally, I'm from Montreal, Canada, but I've been in the region, as Ambassador Kelly said, I've been in the region for 20 years, in Hanoi for 3 years, and 10 years in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and now I'm talking to you from Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Next slide, please. So government response to COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, it has been very varied. You can see they were not that unified in terms of their response. And each country had taking a quite different approach, both related to the crisis and related to the different measures they're putting in place. But there's broadly 3-4 big categories of different measures that government have put in place. Banking finance is one, tax is the second, and labor and employment is the third. There's others also, it's not comprehensive. In the last 2 months, I think we've issued over 30 or around 30 legal and tax updates. We have a special C-19 resource hub, so active every week, almost every day there's new directive on restriction on tax, banking and finance, labor, real estate, lease, etc. Very difficult to follow, even for us, but we're doing our best to keep our client up to date. If you look at banking and finance, it again varied a lot between each country. So if you're a financial institution, you really need to look at which country you're looking at. Some have put more moratorium, some have put special debt relief. There's a different treatment on onshore debt and offshore debt, etc. Very important to look at this if you're a borrower or if you're a lender on the particular measure in the country you are. So if you're operating in the Philippines or Indonesia or in Vietnam, the 3 places are the approach have been completely different. So it's very tailored from a government perspective. Next slide, please. The other is tax. That's, I would say, other than Singapore, it has been the main mean for the government in ASEAN to help company operating in ASEAN is through fiscal relief, I would say, giving you longer time to launch your tax return, to pay them, exemptions during the COVID-19 crisis, etc. The government in this region, if you compare to what we see in Canada and Quebec, there's a huge gap. Our government, both provincial government, federal government, have been much more generous or have the mean to be much more generous, both with staff and with companies, compared to the region here, where probably fiscally it would have been more difficult to put similar measure as in Canada or certain province, like in my home province, Quebec. But this being said, there is. So again, if you're operating, look on an individual basis what the country is offering. It's changing on a weekly basis, so it's important to look at it in detail. Here you just have a few examples of some country with some measures. The next one, labor. On labor, the main issue has been a lot of enterprise had to restructure during this time. We've been advising dozens and dozens of clients on that aspect. Most hopefully are trying to preserve, and some measures of the government preserve employment, and some measures of government are helping this. So that's a good thing. So again, very different approach from each country. It has to be really tailored. In most cases, not all, but most cases, you need the consent of the employees when you want to put certain preventive measure or certain special measure. Unless you're completely closed, etc., then certain countries allows you in certain way to do some restructuring. So these are generally the measures. There's much more. As I said, we published about 30 legal and tax update, and I'm sure we haven't covered everything. We've covered what we have seen that our clients are most interested. If I see the opportunities, again, I'm looking at them from a short-term, medium, and long-term perspective, but I put this in the time frame of the C-19. So it's not the usual medium-term, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term time frame. But in the short term, and I'm talking now, in C-19 lockdowns, although a lot of lockdown are being lifted, like here in Ho Chi Minh City is practically, in Vietnam as a whole, is practically all lifted, except foreign travel. But during the lockdown, what are the opportunities? First, what I just described, C-19 governmental measures. Important to follow this, to be able to seize these opportunities that the government are giving you in tax and labor, in banking and finance and leases, real estate, to help you alleviate the burden or the difficulty under C-19. So that's what we see our clients have been doing in the last, I would say, 2-3 months. The other thing that we've seen opportunity, it's an opportunity for everybody to revise your crisis management process and your business continuity. What we've seen, the enterprises that have been able to show to their client business continuity have been the ones who have been able to strive the most during the C-19 lockdown. At some stage, some enterprise, example us, we had 400 staff all working from home, and surprisingly, we're able to service our client almost as if we were in the office, not exactly, but almost. So that was a bit challenge, but it's an opportunity at the same time to showcase to your client that although things are difficult, people are not moving, as John said, we're able to continue servicing our business either through the net or through a virtual conference call, etc. Next slide, please. In terms of medium term opportunities, and I would call it the C-19 rebound, and there's a big debate, will be a V, U, W, X, etc. I'm not an economist, I can't really pronounce myself with credibility on it, but what we see in any case, if there is a rebound, if it's a slow or sharp, etc., there's going to be opportunity. On the agri-food business, what we're hearing is definitely diversification. People want to have more suppliers in case something else in the future happens or during this period, which could be great opportunity for Canadian business. I saw on the list of John, there is some seafood, there's also meat product, wine products, etc., which are not that present for now from a Canadian perspective in Southeast Asia. We could increase greatly this in diversifying. The lot come from New Zealand and Australia. I'm quite sure business here would be open from to open a new channel and new diversification from Canadian enterprises. Second one, supply chain. What we're hearing from a client is proximity. People will try not to have too long and too extended supply chain, and diversification, not only relying on one supplier. The example we have during the crisis is China. Was when China was in lockdown, several of our clients manufacturing had difficulty getting their product to manufacture. So proximity and diversification, again, opportunity for Canadian enterprises, because instead of getting product from just one place, they'll try to get the product from 2 or 3 places and diversify their supply. The third big opportunity we see is infrastructure. I think John mentioned it also, both in the energy side, the transport side. We see that the government will want to accelerate these projects. Vietnam already said this, Myanmar has said this, Thailand has said this also, to help them rebound from the C-19. And with the increased debt of each local government due to C-19, we expect more PPP projects. So they'll be looking for private financing and private investor investing in these projects. So we see railway, airports, energy, and water as the prime sector, which will open up even further. It's already pretty open up, but will open up even further in the future. Just to complete long-term opportunity, which is much more, so next slide, please. It's much more difficult to predict. But definitely, when I say long-term, it could be fall, it could be early next year. M&A opportunities for either distressed asset or people looking for partners. That might be opportunity for Canadian enterprises. We have some funds who specialize in these type of asset. For now, they're not moving that quickly. What they're telling us is waiting. They're waiting more in the fall or next year. And so we think you'll have several opportunities in the real estate sector, energy sector, transport sector, etc., where you'll have company who will have had more difficulty during the C-19 and will be looking either to sell or to get new partner. That again could be opportunity for Canadian company. Just final slide. If you need more information, we have a DFDL COVID-19 resource hub It's freely accessible. There's about 30, so I can't cover all of this during this presentation, but there's plenty of information. It's freely accessible. So please take that opportunity. There's us, there's others that also have resource up to get more information on how to seize these opportunities in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Great. John and Martin, thank you very much for your presentations. At this point, we are going to open the floor up for questions. Just to get things going, I'm going to begin with a question for John at Tractus Asia. John, I'm wondering if you have any advice for Canadian companies in terms of market access and sales channels into ASEAN.
Yeah, it's a good question. The sales channels have changed a little bit with COVID-19. There's a lot more focus on e-commerce, which was happening already. And I think that the companies that look at e-commerce platforms across the region and take the time to evaluate those in each country are going to see that there are opportunities where they're not going to have to make a lot of bricks and mortar investment or spend a lot of time coming into the region to do so. So I think that that's one big opportunity. The other side is I really think that some of the traditional areas that Canada has been strong in that we talked about earlier, particularly, and Martin talked about it also on the agro-food side across the spectrum. We, from a private sector standpoint, have more demand right now from companies that are trying to bring their food products into Asia as a whole. And I'll give a really interesting example. As the world, particularly North America, has gotten healthy, confectionaries, chocolates, sugars have been things that, people have kind of, not gone into unless it's a really specialty player. There's a big boom right now in ASEAN and the rest of Asia because it's something that the disposable income that you have allows you to buy. And so snack foods and confectionaries and things like that are really booming. We have a couple of clients that make biscuits, cookies. They can't supply fast enough into the region. Others that are doing candies, they're looking at expansion strategies. So I think that those are some things that historically you may not have thought about, that there may be a niche market in ASEAN for your products.
John, thank you very much for that answer. And coincidentally, Ambassador Peter MacArthur, who's in Philippines and is on the line today, was telling me last week that he was very excited to discover that he was able to source Canadian chips in Manila. And so that has been his treat during lockdown. Maybe one more question for you before I head over to Martin. And thank you for highlighting the particular opportunities that exist in the agri-food sector. We are certainly receiving a lot of inquiries within the Mission Network with regard to food security and food supply. So from a Mission perspective, that's also an area that we're seeing growing increase. In terms of my second question, I'm wondering if you believe that there are particular ASEAN countries that you would advise Canadian companies to focus their business development on, whether it be on agri-food, infrastructure, any of the other sectors that you've outlined.
Well, I think what's so interesting about ASEAN is the 10 nations go from some of the least developed or, that have the most growth potential, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, to, of course, what can arguably be called the most developed market in the world with that you have located, Ambassador Kelly, Indonesia, this massive market that is starting, to emerge and grow. You have more established places like Thailand. You have Vietnam that's been attracting investment. So I think what, the advice I would give Canadian companies is that for your product or service, there probably is an ASEAN market that's going to be a good fit for it. It's not going to be all of ASEAN. And so, if you think about a country like Myanmar, Myanmar needs everything, right? And Canadian companies are in a good position to supply into a place that needs everything. the opposite end of the spectrum, you know, if you look at something like Singapore, where there's a huge amount of fintech technology going on, Canadian fintech companies coming in and partnering there and rolling across the region. So, you know, I don't think there's a specific product or service I would target. I would say take the time to look at each market for what you do in terms of your product or service, and you're going to find an ASEAN opportunity.
Great, thank you for that. Martin, at this point, I have a couple of questions for you as well. We have seen that the ASEAN M&A and expansions have slowed down substantially during the COVID-19 lockdowns. When and how do you expect the transactions and expansions to resume in the region, including by Canadian-based companies?
You're correct that the M&A has slowed down, not completely. There's still some transaction either being completed because they had started before C-19, or a few starting during C-19, but it's rarer. M&A was one of our biggest practice, and it really has dwelled down during this time and has been replaced by regulatory advice, which notably what John said, a lot of regulatory advice to fintech and tech company that are looking at market are taking this opportunity to open up or offer their service on the fintech and tech side. When the M&A market will be coming back, that's a good question. M&A, based on our experience, it might change in the future, but up to now was a lot based on people and businessmen allowed to travel. And because they go meet their partner, they go meet the target, they go see the factory, they go see the company, which is not possible now. So will that change because of this? It might be. Will there be less preliminary, I would say, in an M&A deal? It might be, but for the short term, the culture of the M&A has been a lot of businessmen traveling, Chinese traveling to Vietnam or Thailand and making acquisition, etc. So until the travel resumes between these different countries, and that's a big question mark on when that will happen, I think you will not see an uptick in the M&A. I think it's quite interlinked unless people really change their culture quickly. I think it's linked with when the borders will start opening. We all hope, and like John travel a lot, we all hope that it's going to be sooner than later, and it might be just on a regional basis initially. So I wouldn't make a hard prediction, but assuming that travel starts slowly to come back in June, July, you can probably start seeing some M&A activity in the fall. And some will be linked to distressed assets or assets that have been in difficulty during the C-19 crisis. So best predicting, an optimistic prediction is a return of M&A activity September, October, assuming that the C-19 crisis remains under control in this region.
Great. Thank you for that very thoughtful response. I'm going to use that to segue into one of the questions that we have received from participants. And that is directed to both of you. We'll start with John and then Martin. And that is, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on the travel and tourism industries in ASEAN?
That's a great question, and I just actually moderated an event on hospitality and tourism, and unfortunately, the impact has been severe. And the forecasts are that it you know, even in countries that start to open up, as Martin just said, are going to open up within region. I mean, there was talk just yesterday between Thailand and Vietnam of being able to allow travel for tourism between the two countries. I think if you look at hotels, about 90% of the hotels are not operating, the big chains right now. The ones that are operating are ones that have been innovative and have looked at what products can they put out in the market. There's an example here in Thailand of part of the Accor group, the Movenpick Swiss chain, where they're actually bringing, as people are coming back from abroad, there's a 14-day quarantine package that people stay in the hotel versus staying within a government place, and it's all inclusive. I think the big thing on tourism and hospitality will really be the messaging, and Martin brought this up earlier, is talking to your staff and talking and positioning with your customers of something unique. I was talking last night with a hotelier, and he was talking about the focusing on wellness and looking at regional tours where people are biking and hiking and using the hotel as a base to then go around the region on, small groups. And so it's going to come back, but I think the overall forecast, unfortunately, is it's going to be a pretty slow development, and it's going to look pretty different over the next couple of years.
If I may, I think the first phase, and that's what's happening, we're seeing happening, for example, in Vietnam, is local tourism. So at least there is some activity. It's not at the height of when you had thousands, hundreds of thousands of tourists coming from abroad, but at least there is some activity now on the local tourism when the lockdown are lifted. And there's quite a lot of people were at home, and they're more than happy to. So, for example, on certain weekends recently, the hotels on the beach near Ho Chi Minh City were fully booked. So there is some. So it will be some domestic, but again, before the flights are reopened, and the main clients of Southeast Asia was China. I think it was 40% of the tourists in Thailand. It was the same thing in Cambodia. So before the flights and there's an opening of the border with China, I think it would be mainly domestic, or maybe between certain countries that John just said. So a slow return, but the big question is when they're going to reopen this without a quarantine. Nobody will come visit the country if you need to spend 14 days in quarantine. It's not it can be maybe in a nice hotel, like John said, but I'm not sure that will prevent most people from traveling. So I think initially will be domestic until all the lockdown, that's what we're seeing now in Vietnam, and eventually regional. And hopefully, once they open up with China, that will be the trigger, given how millions of Chinese were visiting throughout Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you. On that note, there have been a number of significant articles looking at private and government strategies to shift investment and supply chains out of China to ASEAN for both economic and political reasons, and accelerating existing trends. Wondering if you have any comments or observations. That is one of the questions from a participant. And the same order, we can go into, yeah, please proceed.
Sure. Ambassador Kelly, it's a good question, and I want to make sure that the people understand this trend happened long before COVID-19. Risk mitigations really began in 2010 when we had the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and then the Thai floods, where C-suites around the world started looking at the interruptions on supply chains, and then you had political issues in ASEAN, the recent Hong Kong protests, and so risk mitigation has taken a much more prominent place in the manufacturing or service sector site selection process. And so I think the trend of companies moving out of China into ASEAN was already occurring, but it wasn't occurring only for example, to go to Vietnam and export back to Canada or the US. It was looking at, can we move to a place like Vietnam and then take advantage of ASEAN's domestic 10-country market as well as export. And then you're seeing the other trend you're seeing is smaller operations, more highly automated, more artificial intelligence in them, leapfrogging technologies, fewer people, higher needs for technically capable people. And so there's really been an evolution that started about 10 years ago that COVID is just accelerating.
Yeah, the ANZ published a report like 5-6 years ago, ANZ Bank, and they call it the Great Migration South. essentially the manufacturing base moving south from China. So that, as John just said, that has started. I think C-19 will accelerate this even further. The trade war between the U.S. and China had accelerated this. Hong Kong issues had accelerated this, and I think C-19 will be one of will leapfrog even the acceleration of this migration south of the manufacturing base. I do think Vietnam will probably be one of the main beneficiary, but all ASEAN countries will benefit from it. And particularly for Canadian company, what's interesting for Vietnam is a Trans-Pacific trade agreement. There's only 4 members of ASEAN who are a member of that agreement, and so it makes Vietnam probably particularly attractive for any members of that Trans-Pacific trade agreement. So definitely the move will accelerate, and what I said, the shortening of the supply line will also even further accelerate it, because if you move your factory here in Vietnam, you probably want your supplier to be closer to you also. So that will also be opportunity for Canadian company who would like to establish operation here within a group of supplier that would supply a manufacturing base here or in Cambodia or in Thailand.
Great, thank you both. Martin, I have a follow-up question for you on the M&A issue, and a participant is asking, what about longer-term expatriation of Canadian employees who are sent by Canadian companies to secure new sales, business channels, or source new supply chains? Do you see these assignments coming back in the mid-long term? And what are the implications given that local contacts for long-term business success are important in ASEAN?
That's one of the main issue I've always been discussing with Canadian enterprises. When they're trying to do business in ASEAN, they often try to do it on a fly-in, fly-out basis. And it unfortunately has, in my view, very limited success, except maybe for pure trading of goods. But if you want to establish a joint venture or develop an infrastructure project or energy project, being on the ground, in my view, is essential. And it's usually the first step. So if Canadian enterprise want to continue in that trend in investing in this country, I think it's a sine qua non requirement of having people on the ground. Does it need automatically to be a Canadian coming here, or hiring competent local staff? Then it really depends a bit your type of business. Both have used different business model. But in general, what we've seen in ASEAN over time with the competency going up is the requirement for expatriates have generally tended to go down. Although there's still, instead of having some company have 15 expatriates, they'll have 3 or 4, and the rest will be staff from the country. So it's really probably depending on the business you are in. But I do think that it will still be essential to have a base here to develop business here. Therefore, there'll still be opportunity for a Canadian expatriate to come here and work in the region, either in Singapore, Vietnam, or Indonesia.
And Ambassador Kelly, maybe I could add to that, because I agree with Martin that personal touch and needing to be in the region is never going to go away. There are some interesting things, though, that I think are happening. Travel is going to be different. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but it's going to be different. It's going to probably be more expensive, which is going to make that travel a tougher decision on corporate budgets. And then the other thing that's happening with the technology that we're using today, as an example, that I mentioned earlier, is I think you're starting to develop those relationships before you would have previously. Previously, I would have gotten on a plane, flown to Singapore to meet somebody to see if we were, could develop a relationship. Now, when I'm going down, I'm likely potentially doing a deal. And so one of the things I think that is opening up with the technology is the world is going to be your labor pool. You're not going to see a labor pool that is just in any of the domestic countries. And so while that's sort of always been the case in terms of offshoring, I think the technology that we're now employing is going to allow a lot more communication. And so to use Martin's example, hiring a person on the ground in one of the ASEAN countries may be something that Canadian companies do earlier on, and then they don't travel as much because of the ability to communicate. So I think we're going to see a different way of having those touch points and building those relationships. But in the end, there still will be, the need to, maybe we no longer shake hands, we're doing the Thai Y or something else, but there will be a personal touch that comes back.
Great observations. On that, we've also received a question from one of the participants asking what software or tech companies can do to learn about market opportunities and how to do business development during these times with regard to accessing clients. So John, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends, as I said earlier, on which country in ASEAN, because it's very different. But I'll use Singapore as an example. And, our Singapore country manager, Uday, is there. We have a number of tech companies, including Canadian, but from around the globe, that see it as a hub for rolling out technologies in the region. And so it's a great place to start. There are a number of government-sponsored tech accelerators. There are a number of programs that try to match you with companies in Singapore, whether it's on the development side or on the commercialization side. And so if I'm a tech company, I'm probably going to start there and then look at the other markets. And it's not just Singapore. I mean, there's lots of software, and one of the biggest gaming companies in the world is out of Vietnam. There's development rapidly on new software development in Thailand. So there's a lot going on in the region, but maybe start with Singapore and work with some of the structure, the infrastructure they have in place for the IT.
I can't give a better answer than John, so I'll leave it there.
All right, that's high praise. Our final, it's almost wrap up time, so I'm going to put one final question to both of you, and that is, in your views, do you think ASEAN will be more open to free trade agreements, such as the one that Canada is pursuing? Thoughts on that subject?
Martin, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I do think yes, and they will want to diversify. They're highly dependent with some neighbors. So the more they're diversified, the more, if there's again this similar type of crisis, they will be able to look at different suppliers, different countries to help them. So I do think it will increase their appetite to have more of these free trade agreements.
Yeah, I would add, I think there's a big opportunity now for Canada to pursue free trade agreements. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think the ASEAN Economic Community itself, because of its diversity and sort of long-term vested interest, despite its cooperation, make it hard to work across the region versus working bilateral. But I do believe that there are significant opportunities right now. Martin mentioned earlier TPP and the limited number of ASEAN players that are involved in that. And I think that Canada itself should pursue bilateral trade agreements with a number of the ASEAN trading partners, particularly because, and you mentioned earlier, Ambassador Kelly, Australia and New Zealand got ahead of everyone on some of those in the region, and it's been very successful for them.
Thank you. Well, I also share your optimism. Let's call it realistic optimism. I do think that ASEAN will be more open to trade diversification, including free trade agreements. But given that the 10 ASEAN member states, are not homogenous in terms of their governance systems and their economic models, it is quite tricky dealing with them as a bloc. but we will do our darndest, and I think with continued advocacy efforts by the missions, with senior officials within the private sector, I am optimistic that we will be able to get there. So we will continue to keep you posted and work together as we advance that objective. Before handing it back over to Greg, I would just like to thank once again Wayne and the team at CABC for inviting me to participate today. I'm also very happy to see that we had 5 bilateral Canadian Chambers of Commerce participate. I have had the honor of working with members both in CABC and the bilateral chambers for almost 2 years now. And what I have continuously said is that, you know, they should serve, CABC can serve as a force multiplier for your engagement in your specific country of residence in terms of promoting the Canada-Asia advantage and demonstrating the quality of Canadian goods and services and how to, you know, fill gaps in existing markets and increase service standards. So I think the fact that we have 5 bilateral chambers participating with the CABC for today's event is fantastic. As noted earlier, it's an example of the innovation that we're seeing under these trying times. And I certainly look forward to participating in more of these jointly organized sessions. And I'm sure this will be mentioned by Greg as well, but thank you very much to John and Martin for your insight today, for your very thoughtful presentations about the challenges and opportunities under the current circumstances and how Canadian companies can be creative and take advantage of the opportunity. So thank you very much. Thank you to the participants, and Greg, over to you for the wrap up.
There we go. Thanks very much, Ambassador. I think that's a perfect closing note. And let me just echo what you said about the support from the Chambers of Commerce as well, who without them, we wouldn't have been able to have such a in-depth regional participation. And thanks very much for your remarks and for guiding this really interesting and fruitful discussion for Canadian businesses that are navigating this COVID-19 crisis here on the ground in ASEAN. And of course, a big thanks again as well to John, to Uday and the team at Tractus for all of your support. And thank you, Martin, very much for DFDL's great contributions. We did cover a lot of ground today, and it's fantastic to have seen such a high turnout of business leaders from around the world. And there were really great questions. We weren't able to get through everything, but this is fortunately the first in a 2-part series that we're running with Tractus. So we'll be bringing this same network together again for our next webinar later in the month, likely on the 28th of May. And so we'll be building on this discussion and also looking at some in-depth case studies of Canadian companies in ASEAN and looking at how they're responding to the challenges to their business from COVID-19. So more details on that will come soon. I encourage everyone who is not already following the CABC on social media or our newsletter to do so. We'll share some links in the chat section on that. And if any companies on the call would like to learn more about CABC, to connect with us and understand how we can be a partner for their growth in ASEAN, please drop us a note or an email, and look forward to speaking with you. So that brings us to the end of our program for today. So thanks again to all the speakers and to everyone for dialing in. And we wish you a good evening or morning ahead, and to speaking with you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.